Javante, who talked to me about him before and everything. So I got to meet him, met in Worcester together, and spent a couple hours together, and just very impressed with his testimony and the things he shares and all that he's done and is doing in his life, and how God's using him in a mighty way. So that's how I got to know him. But I'd like Javante to tell you more about Ken.
Hi again. Yeah, so today we have our guest speaker, Ken Brown, here. I'll give a little bit of background. I'll try to make it quick of the connection. So, through his daughter, Ariana, those who know me for quite some time know that I had a little career at ESPN Cleveland. That's where me and her daughter met. And one day, I forgot how the conversation came about, but our faith got brought up. And through the conversation at work, we formed a connection just based off the faith that we both shared. Through that, we became really good friends. Through time, years, months after that, she left the company, I left the company. Those who know me, I went to Milwaukee and worked in the Milwaukee location up with ESPN. And we stayed in touch. And through my years at ESPN Milwaukee and towards the time where I came and decided to move back, was going through a lot of personal things. And reached out to Ariana and was telling her everything that I was kind of going through. And then think that's when she told me that her and her family, you guys were coming up to a Milwaukee Bucks or Brewers games. Unfortunately for them, they're Milwaukee fans, sports fans. So, um, so she told me that her and her family were coming up for a Bucks or a Brewers game, one of the two. Brewers game. Unfortunately, again. And she told me that how her father was a mentor to young adults, her and her brother's age, and the things that he do mentorship-wise, and wanted me to meet him. So upon their arrival, we had dinner or lunch, met the whole Brown family, and through that conversation and connection that we had that moment, Ken started to fellowship to me. Told me a little bit about his story, um, and it really moved me. It moved me in such a way that I became what I like to call a mentee to Ken, and to continue to follow his words and his guidance. And through that, we got to know each other a lot better, got a lot closer. Um, he sends weekly motivations, and those are just anything to help guidance through life situations, and also what's more importantly is the faith in these testimonies that he shares. And one of the great things that he's taught me is how to see, a positive in all types of situation, and to remain strong in faith. So through his story, it's an incredible story, and he'll obviously share, and you'll get to know him more about it. But through his story and his friendship and his mentorship alone has been an instrument to my life. No matter how much or little we talk or meet, he has definitely provided a huge impact in my life, in my faith, and has helped me, continue to grow in that. And right now in his life, he feels like, well, his calling is to be a motivational speaker. He's already spoke at many different churches of all sizes, different institutions, and today he has graced us with his presence to speak and share his testimony today with us. So feel like I said enough, but before I bring him up, I'd just like to pray over Ken. Um, Gracious Heavenly Father, thank you for the connection that you have brought me with Ken, and thank you that um, we are able to share him today to us, to our church, to our congregation, Lord. We appreciate his journey, and just pray that you be with him as he speaks to us, and let his story reflect your presence, Lord, and your greatness and the mightiness of your love and your testament to not only him, but to all of us. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I present to you Ken Brown.
We good? All right. So we'll start here. Quick show of hands. Do we have anybody here that enjoys golf? Anybody here that hates golf? We've got a few more hands here, right? Regular golf, top golf, mini golf, any kind of golf. What's the term that they use in golf when you hit a terrible shot and you're like, I don't want to count that one. I'm just going to take a detour. What's the term? Mulligan, right? It's a mulligan. And mulligans are great for golf. But in real life, there's no such thing as much as we wish there was. Now, when my wife and I first got married, we lived in Chicago for the first 2.5 years before we finally settled here in Ohio. And we found out on our 1-year anniversary that we were pregnant with our daughter, Ariana. Now, go back to that moment for your first child, right? For me, I was very overwhelmed and not in a good way. I was immediately thinking, we don't have any money. We can't afford this. Mentally, spiritually, physically, emotionally, I was not ready or equipped to be a dad. I'm not sure I'm equipped now at 55, right? But definitely at 25, I was not ready. And I wanted to start crying, but I happened to notice my wife was already crying. I thought we both can't be crying at the same time in this moment. So I just encouraged her, said, you know what, everything's going to be okay. It's going to be fine. So a few weeks later, my wife Leslie, she said she wanted to go visit her family here in Ohio. Now, my wife Leslie, she grew up in Fort Jennings, Ohio. And if you don't know Fort Jennings, Ohio, it's probably a good reason. It's a really, really, really small farming community. In fact, the town is so small, they don't have a gas station. They don't even have a stoplight. It is that small. I didn't realize that there were towns that small. I grew up in Chicago suburbs. I had no idea. And so her parents, they don't even live in town. They're more remote, several miles outside of town. So one Friday after work, we decided that we'll go for the weekend. And so after work, we grabbed some dinner, we packed a bag, we started driving to here, Ohio. And by the time we got through Fort Wayne, Indiana, it was getting pretty late. It was starting to push midnight. And I was sitting at a stoplight. And my wife leans over to look at the gas gauge. Right? This is not her first rodeo with me. And she sees the gas gauge leaning up against the big giant E. And she asked the obvious question, are you stopping for some gas? Right? Now, she asked this question for 2 reasons. One, there's a gas station right in front of us on the other side of the stoplight. And 2, this is the last gas station between us and Van Wert, Ohio, a town 25 miles away. There's nothing in between. I said, you know what? I got this. We'll be fine. Right? She starts to squirm in her chair a little bit, right? She's a little bit nervous. But you know what? I was right. And we did make it to Van Wert. And then I got to thinking, if we could make it 25 miles almost on empty, certainly we could make it 20 miles more to her parents' house outside of Fort Jennings. So I kept on driving. And when my wife realized that I was driving past the Van Wert exit and the gas station that was right there, she again leans over to look at the gas gauge. And she now sees that gas gauge buried on the wrong side of E. And again, she asked the obvious question, but this time with much more urgency. What are you doing? I was like, don't worry. I got this. We're going to be fine. So I keep on driving. We got off the main highway, started taking the back roads to her parents' house. 2 miles before we got there, it happened. And I ran out of gas. I kicked the car into neutral, and I started coasting as far as I could. My wife turns to me and says, quit goofing. I'm tired, I'm pregnant, I just want to go to bed. And then she realized I wasn't goofing. I pushed the car in silence that last 1.5 miles. Now, I wish that I could tell you that that was the first time, or even the last time, that I've run out of gas. But I can't. There was one time I was coming back from a college football game with a buddy, and it was late at night, and ran out of gas, and we had to make about a 1-mile round-trip walk to and from a gas station in a cold, steady rain. There was another time I ran out of gas on Valentine's Day, ended up being late for dinner with my wife. There was one time I ran out of gas on Interstate 75 during evening rush hour. Right? You got cars and semis buzzing along 75, 80, 85 miles an hour. So I pulled my car off the interstate, off to the shoulder. I get out of my car and I start walking up the way. I got about a 2-mile hike to the nearest exit where there's a gas station. 2 minutes later, an elderly woman who looked to be about 80 to 85 years old pulls her car off the interstate next to me and asks, do you need a ride? I cannot explain this, right? An elderly woman pulling off the interstate to pick up a strange man. Yeah, yes, I did because I thought it had to be a guardian angel. There's no other explanation for it. And I don't normally get in cars with strangers, but I thought, okay, if she's not a guardian angel and she had bad intentions for me, I could probably take her, right? I could defend myself. But she was so nice and she was so sweet, and she took me up to the gas station. She offered to pay for my gas, and then she brought me back to my vehicle. There was another time I ran out of gas. I was on my way to a meeting for work. It was in the middle of summer. It was a beautiful day, 75 degrees, blue skies. Again, 2 minutes later, this guy comes tooling up on a motorcycle. Says, hey, you want to ride on my motorcycle? I was like, yeah, I want to ride on a motorcycle. How cool is that? So that time it wasn't so bad. There was another time I ran out of gas. I go on for hours here. There was another time I ran out of gas. Have I what?
Have you learned yet?
No, I'm a work in progress.
We bought a Tesla, so you know I'm a little bit.
Yeah. So I finally got a Tesla. I can't run out of gas. But yeah, I ran out of gas on my way to my daughter's junior high basketball game, and there's been several times when I ran out of gas on my way home from work. All told, I have run out of gas 14 times. Right? It's got to be a record. It's a record nobody wants, but I have it. And each time it happens, I think, I wish I could take a mulligan. I wish I had a do-over. But life doesn't work that way, right? Let's rewind a little bit. The home that I grew up in, and Jay touched on this a little bit, it was filled with poverty, violence, and trauma. I literally spent half my childhood hiding underneath my bed or hiding in my closet. A lot of that was driven by my mom, who had a severe mental illness, and as a result of that, I didn't see or speak to my mom the last 19 years of her life until one day I got a phone call and she was gone. When I was a kid, I wanted what every kid wants, and I needed what every kid needs. That's for their dad, just every once in a while. Just to give them a hug, give them a kiss on the forehead, look them straight in the eye and say, I love you, I'm proud of you. I never had that kind of relationship with my dad. For the most part, he never wanted a whole lot to do with me. The dynamic of our relationship was such that we could talk about sports a little bit. We could talk about the weather. When I got older, we could talk about work a little bit. But it was never a meaningful conversation. It was never an enjoyable conversation where it's free-flowing like you have with a friend. Our conversations were always awkward and forced and clunky, and I hated it. I hated it. In time, I hated him. When my dad was a kid, his father was abusive. By the time my dad was a teenager, he'd had enough. So at age 15, my dad left home and he never went back. I remember I was 8 years old when my dad got the phone call that his dad died. And I remember watching him so closely that night and for the next several nights. And it was so strange to me because there was no response, there was no emotional reaction from my dad. It was like somebody just told my dad regular information. Hey, tomorrow it's going to be sunny and 75. Okay. Tomorrow there's a chance of rain. Okay. Your dad just died. Okay. There was nothing. Every kid, whether they're 8 or 18, right, we all want the same thing. And that's for mom and dad to come and support them in whatever activity that they participate in. Whether they're part of the school play or the school band or they're part of the athletic team, right? Just want mom and dad there in the seats, encouraging them, cheering for them, being a part of it, right? My dad, right, we talked about it. My dad never did that. After my wife and I got married, we had our daughter Ariana, and a few years later, we had our son Bryce. And I thought, well, now that he's got some grandkids, maybe now he'll want to be more involved in my life, be more part of it. Unfortunately, for the most part, that didn't change. I remember when my daughter was 8 years old, she asked me one day, she said, how come Papa Brown never comes to the things when I invite him? I invite him to my Mighty Mites basketball games and my t-ball games and my dance recitals and the grandparents' day at school. I said, you know what, Ariana, that's a really good question. The next time he calls, you should ask him that. So a couple months later, my dad calls the house, my daughter answers the phone, and the first words out of her mouth, Papa Brown, how come you never come to any of the things when I invite you? I don't know what he said, but for the most part, it didn't change too much. A few years later, my wife and I were in the process of building a house. And so one morning, we took the kids to school, we dropped them off at school, and then we were driving to our meeting to meet with our architect so we could finalize the blueprints. Halfway to that meeting, I got a phone call from a nurse at a hospital in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where my dad lived. She said, your dad just suffered a major stroke, and we're calling the family in so they can say goodbye. I told the nurse, I said, I'm sorry, but I'm several hours away here in Ohio. And to be honest, I don't have that kind of a relationship with my dad. So maybe if he gets better in a few weeks, we'll come and see him. The nurse said, I can't speak to the relationship that you have or that you don't have with your dad. I can only tell you that he's very sick, and we don't think he's going to make it through the night. Got off the phone, and immediately my wife said, let's cancel our meeting, let's get the kids out of school, and let's drive to Milwaukee before it's too late. I told my wife, I said, this meeting's important. We need to get the blueprints finalized. This is important. And school's important. There's no need to pull the kids out of school today. The reality is I was just a train wreck inside. I didn't want to be there when my dad died. So we went to our meeting. We waited until 3 o'clock in the afternoon to get the kids from school. And then we drove up to Milwaukee. Got to the hospital that night, and I walked into his room, and he was hooked up to all these wires and machines. And my dad woke up shortly after that, and when he saw me, he became very emotional. He was trying desperately to tell me something. But the damage from the stroke, he was having a hard time putting words together, so he gestured like this. So I got him a pen and a pad of paper so he could write what he was trying to say. But again, the stroke, it was just scratch marks on a paper. My dad fell asleep after that. My wife took the kids to a hotel for the night, and I just pulled up a chair right next to his bed. And I stared at my dad the entire night. And I thought, if he wakes up and we could have a real conversation for the very first time, what would I say? By the time the sun came up the next morning, I still didn't have an answer to that question. My dad survived the night, he survived the next night, and the day after that, he started to stabilize, so we came back home to Ohio. A couple months later, my wife said, let's go visit your dad. And immediately, I had 100 different reasons why we shouldn't go. And my wife just cut me off. She said, the kids want to see their Papa Brown, and we're going. By now, my dad was in a nursing home in Milwaukee. When we got there, my dad, he looked like death. He couldn't feed himself or toilet himself. He couldn't dress himself. He couldn't even get in and out of bed by himself. So when we got there were 2 nurses' aides that got him up out of bed, got him cleaned up, got him changed, and then they were assisting walking him to the community room where we could visit with him. And my dad was using a walker, and he could barely move. He was just moving along really slow. We were on the right side of him, walking alongside. There was a nurse's aide over here on the left side holding onto his gait belt to help keep him steady. And there was another nurse's aide with a wheelchair behind him to catch him in case he fell. And as my dad was moving down the hallway very slowly, he suddenly became very emotional. And he started to tremble. And he told those 2 nurse's aides, these are my grandkids who've come to visit me. And then with tears welling up in his eyes, he said, this is my son who's come from Ohio to see me. I was so bitter. I was so bitter. I thought, no way. I thought for 37 years, I don't matter, my family doesn't matter, and now you're knocking on death's door, now suddenly this is important? I just thought, no way. I thought, this isn't how this goes. This isn't how this ends. We visited with my dad for a little bit that day. Got a hotel, we came back and visited with again the next day. We're getting ready to leave to come back home to Ohio. My dad was laying in his bed, and I was standing at the foot of it. I was looking down at him, and he was looking up at me. There were no words spoken in this moment. But we both knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was it. This is the last time we're ever going to see each other. What would you say in a moment like this, right? It's complicated and it's messy. And the space between you is just filled with brokenness. What would you say? My wife, she called the kids in to come say goodbye. They had no idea this is the last time they were ever going to see their grandpa. To them, he was sick, he was going to get better, and everything was going to be okay. My son Bryce was 7 years old at the time, and he came running in first. He jumped up on my dad's bed. He gave him a big hug. He said, I love you, Papa Brown. My dad said, I love you too, Bryce. My daughter Ariana was 11 years old. She came walking around up to the side of the bed. She gave him a big hug. She said, "I love you, Papa Brown." He said, "I love you too, Ariana." Kids scurried back out into the hallway. My wife, Leslie, was standing at the head of his bed. She leaned down, gave him a hug. She said, "I love you, Papa Brown." My dad said, "I love you too, Leslie." My wife walked around behind me, and then she stood between me and the door. She wanted to be in a position where she could keep an eye on the kids, but where she could also keep an eye on me. She sensed what I already knew, that this was it. There's no do-overs for a moment like this. And she wanted to make sure I got this moment right. So I stood there for several seconds in silence, thoughts racing through my head. Do I lean into this moment and try to embrace the moment and make the best of it? Or do I continue to clutch all the pain, all the hurt, and all the scars? Finally, after several seconds, I broke the silence with 3 words. See you later. But it's not the see you later that you tell a friend, right? See you next week at church. See you tomorrow at work. See you Friday at the game. This was cold, calculated, and cutting. I packaged those 3 words as a weapon, and I shot him straight through his heart. I could tell by the look on his face he knew exactly what I meant when I said it. 37 years of cuts and scars. This was my mic drop moment. I win. And before he had a chance to respond, I turned my back, I walked out, and I never looked back. My wife was shocked. I got out into the hallway, I told the kids it's time to go, and we started making our way down the long corridor toward the exit. 30 feet down the way, my wife grabs my hand and stops me. And she pleads with me, don't do this. Just go back and tell your dad that you love him. I pulled my hand away. I said, I will not do that. I continued walking to the exit. 30 feet down the way, my wife stops me again. This time she jumps right in front of me. She puts her hand on my chest. She said, if you don't want to tell your dad that you love him, that's fine. But just go back and talk to your dad. Have a real conversation with your dad for the first time. Find some closure and find some peace before it's too late. I stepped around her and kept walking to the exit. We got in the car and we came back home to Ohio. A couple of months later, my wife said, let's go visit your dad. I said, that's not happening. She said, all right, if you don't want to see your dad, that's fine. But you can still pick up the phone and call him. It's not too late to find some closure and find some peace and have a real conversation with your dad. So one afternoon, I was working in my office. I was in between some phone calls and emails, had a bit of a break in the day. I thought, maybe my wife is right. This is ruining me. I do need some closure, and I do need some peace. So I picked up the phone to get ready to call him. I was staring at the phone, and I thought, how do you start a conversation like that? And I thought, well, baseball season had just started. Our favorite team was the Milwaukee Brewers, and I thought maybe we could talk about that for a few minutes and it would lead to an opportunity where we could have a real conversation for the first time. 5 minutes go by. And I'm still staring at the phone, wondering, should I call my dad? 10 minutes goes by. I'm still staring at the phone, wondering if I should call my dad. Finally, after 15 minutes, I put the phone down, and I just thought if I mattered at all to him, he'd call me. Went back to work. Kids came home from school that day. We had dinner, helped them with their homework, played some games, got them tucked into bed, and it was a night like any other night. Except for the fact that shortly after 1 a.m., my wife and I received a phone call. My dad had just died. And I'd always tried to convince myself and tell myself that when that call comes, everything's going to be better because I won't have to deal with this stuff anymore. Instead, it was 1,000 times worse. The next day, I called him to the nursing home, and I talked to his nurse, and I said, what happened? I just need to know what happened. And she said, nothing really. She said, the stroke your dad had a few months ago, it was a major stroke, and he was just never able to recover. She said, it's interesting, though. I've worked in this nursing home a really long time. And every once in a while, somebody knows when their last day is going to be, and they're always right. She said, yesterday morning, your dad woke up, and he was telling everybody here that today was his last day. If I knew that today was my last day, I would call my daughter Ariana and I would tell her one more time how much I love her and that she's a gift from Jesus. And then I would call my son Bryce and I would tell him one more time how much I love him and that he's a gift from Jesus. The day I was holding the phone in my hand, we were both wrong. Over the next several years, I was just consumed with bitterness. And it became this weight and this burden that was too big to carry. And yet we do this in life. We do this, right? Something bad happens to us, and we get cut. And we clutch those scars. And people around us, we say, look what happened to me. And in the process, the only thing that we're doing is we imprison ourselves. We chain ourselves to the scene of the accident, and we never move forward in life. And so for the next several years, this is where I was at. And finally, I heard God tell me I can restore this. And I just thought, God, you can't restore this. And my dad, he's dead and gone. You can't restore that. And it's happened so many times when we are here, we make terrible choices and we just make everything worse. But God just continued to impress on me. I can restore this. I can restore you. Trust me. We read through the Bible, and there are so many incredible stories of God restoring people in impossible situations, right? Job lost everything. And what happens so many times when God restores us, he doesn't just get us back to where we were, he gives us more. And we read at the end of that story that Job received a double blessing from what he had previously. The book of Ruth, oh my goodness, it's a beautiful story. It has so many layers to it. It's about a 20-minute read. Read it sometimes. It's incredible. And the story opens with Naomi. And Naomi's husband dies. And 10 years later, both of her sons die. To be a widow at that time in that culture, that was a hopeless place to be. And we read that Naomi was angry, right? This is where she was at. She was bitter. In fact, she told all of her friends, don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara, because Mara means bitter, right? This is where she was at. And yet her daughter-in-law, Ruth, refused to leave her side. And it was through that relationship that God restored both of them, setting their lineage to King David and ultimately to Jesus Christ. Then we have David, right? King David, arguably the greatest king. David was said to be a man after God's own heart. But David sinned. David made some terrible choices. And I love reading the Psalms that he writes because it's real and it's raw and it's gritty and it's stuff we all relate to. In Psalms 51, David cries out, God, have mercy on me. And then he writes, restore me. 23rd Psalms, David paints this vivid picture. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Right? You want to talk about being in a dark place, a hopeless place? The valley of the shadow of death, that's where David's at. That's a path we've all walked several times in life, right? And yet 2 verses over from that, David writes, God, you lead me beside still waters. You restore my soul. We will always act in accordance to what we think is possible. I'm going to say that again because we've got to come to grips with this. We will always act in accordance to what we think is possible. This is a Romans 12:2 moment, right? You want to change your life, you want to transform your life, you got to change the way you think. Here's the thing, at any given point in time, there are 2 realities that exist at the same exact moment in your life. And over here, we have the reality of impossible. And all the reasons you can list why your situation is impossible, they're all true. But over here, at the same exact moment in time, we have the reality of possible. And all the reasons you can list why your situation is possible, why God's hope is possible, why God's restoration for you is possible, they're all true. Unfortunately, so many times in life, our default position in life is negative and we choose this. We choose this. The thing I wanted more than anything was for a family. And finally, God showed me it's right in front of you. I've given you 2 gifts, a daughter you named Ariana and a son you named Bryce. And slowly, as I started to realize that was the first part of my restoration that God had for me. The second part took much longer. My dad died in 2007. And for the next 16 years, I was haunted by that moment of the last time I saw my dad. I replayed that moment at least 500 times. And I knew God needed to restore this part of me. And so I prayed for months. God, show me, what should I have done? What should I have said the last time I saw my dad? And unfortunately, I knew it wasn't saying I love you because it wouldn't have been true in the moment. Those words would have just been hollow. Finally, God showed me this, 6 words. I wish things would have been different. And I could have said that to him with an open heart, allowing my dad an opportunity to respond in kind. The worst part of life is that we can't go back. There are no do-overs. But the best part of life is that we can still move forward. The problem is, once we realize we can't go back, we convince ourselves that we can't move forward, and that's not true. Those 6 words freed me to move forward. But I knew I needed to create a new memory so that when the bad thoughts came and the bad memories came, I could stake myself to the restoration that God had for me. I only have one truly good memory with my dad. We went to a Milwaukee Brewers game together. It was just the 2 of us. I drove up to Milwaukee. I picked him up at his apartment. Started driving to the stadium, and the conversation in the car was just like always, this awkward, forced, and clunky. And I just thought, what am I even doing here? I hate this. I don't even want to be here. We get to the stadium, and we park out in the parking lot, and then we start to make that long walk to the stadium. Just as we're about to enter the stadium, I can't explain it, but everything changed. And for the next 3.5 hours, we ate hot dogs, we snacked on popcorn, and for the first time in my life, I had an enjoyable conversation with my dad. We didn't talk about anything meaningful, we just talked about baseball. I didn't want the moment to end. When the game was over, we started walking back to the car, and everything just went back to the way it was. But God had given me one moment, one good memory with my dad. So this is what I did. In the summer of 2023, I purchased a bronze rose, and I engraved those 6 words onto the stem. And then my family went with me to the cemetery in Milwaukee where my dad was buried. I stood over his gravesite, and I just let go of all the hurt, and all the pain, and all the scars. And I set that rose on his tombstone. And I simply said, I wish things would have been different. I just felt this enormous weight God lifted from me. That night, I took my family to the Milwaukee Brewers baseball game. And God's restoration for me had come full circle, because I was able to enjoy a game with my family reflective of the one good moment that I had with my dad. I want to read something that I journaled shortly after this, because I think it's going to resonate with a lot of people here today. Trauma is a moment in time, but by carrying it everywhere I go, I've made it timeless. And instead of it being isolated to one moment, I've dragged it with me, smearing the pages of all the other chapters of my story. I didn't have to. I didn't want to. I just didn't know how to let it go. But trauma by its nature is not designed to be carried. I can't hold on to both God and the pain that haunts me. The one I choose to hold is my declaration that the other is powerless in my life. For 5 decades, I believed that God was powerless, and I chose to cling to my trauma. But I'm not a product of my past, the things that happened to me, my pain. I'm a product of God. Pain is no longer my identity. Trauma is merely a moment in time layered between who God is and what Jesus did on the cross. God is the foundation for my life, which ensures no matter the storm that has raged all around me, the foundation for my life stands firm. All that has been destroyed, I will rebuild on that foundation. The cross provides a cleansing from the trauma and a new path forward that otherwise did not exist. My identity is that I'm a child of God, saved by the grace of the cross. That is what I will hold on to. Isaiah 61:3. This is a verse my wife gave me after my dad died. To those who mourn, right? Those who grieve, the brokenhearted, right? We've all been there. To those who mourn, God gives beauty in exchange for ashes, right? We give God the worst parts of us, the broken parts, the dirty parts, the ugly parts, the unidentifiable ashes. And in exchange, God gives us beauty. That's how God defines restoration for all of us. Every single person here has scars, multiple scars. Nobody goes through life unscathed. And every scar tells a story. But if we allow God, it becomes a story of restoration. So today as we close, I'm just going to ask everyone to bow their head. At the end of the service, we're going to have a QR code up on the screen that's going to provide you some more resources for your journey of restoration. But I just want to take a moment and have a couple minutes to give everybody an opportunity to have a moment with God. If you want to stay in your seat there and pray quietly, I encourage that. If you want to come down here to the front, I will pray with you. I will talk with you. My wife will pray with you. Pastor Kale will pray with you. Don't pass on the urgency of this moment to have a little time to talk with God, to pray with God, or have someone pray for you. Don't walk out those doors the same way that you came in.
Let's stand. As Ken said, I just want to welcome you to come forward and spend time with the Lord and pray with him, with Leslie, myself. If you want to pray with us, or like we always do, if there's somebody that you're sitting near and you want to go pray with them, you're welcome to do that.